So hello, everyone. We don't have Fabrizio with us today. He's on vacation, but we are doing our best with Mariana. Thank you, Mariana. And we'll start the meeting right away now. I'll just share my PowerPoint, and we will have Professor Anahy Fonseca is with us today. Just some technical problem. Mariana, have you make me yeah. Let me just see.
Sorry, yes, I did. You are allowed to share.
Okay. Is that, I think it's coming in. Okay. Can you see well, all of you?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So we are talking today about a little more about the ego-self axis and also about the individuation process. I will start with the PowerPoint and then I will give it back to Professor Anahy Fonseca to talk to you about this subject. And so this is my favorite place to go for a walk in Porto Alegre. It's my city in Brazil, in the very south of Brazil. And I always try to walk at sunset. And so synchronistically, last week, I was walking and thinking about the individuation process, the evolution of our consciousness in these times of transition. And I saw this little boat that it was little from far away, right? Was not so little near, but it was looked like a little boat to me. And with its lights. And so the metaphor is here for us all. I wanted to start this beautiful image with the sunset of my city. Okay, so here is a scheme from Jung's process of individuation, okay? So we are going to be talking a little more about the ego self axis today. So to make it clear for everyone. And so we all know by now, as we have been talking, that our egos, or better, our ego complex is one of the emotional toned complexes, okay? A special complex, actually, that carries our conscious awareness. And we know that at the core of any complex is an archetype, right? As we have already said in our meeting about complexes and archetypes, and also about the self. So in the case of the ego complex, the archetype at the core is the self. So just as the ego complex is a special complex, the self is a special archetype because, as we have seen with Professor Corbett, it is related, let's say, with the God image, okay? And according to Jung, so it's connected with this, the God image is connected to the self. So through experience, let's see here first, this first image, I don't know if you're seeing here, okay, the first position at birth, all right? So you can see that at birth, the ego begins as an unconscious potential contained in the self. Okay, it's indifferentiated. So through experience, especially early childhood experiences, the ego complex emerges from the self, as we can see in the second image here. Okay, so the ego begins to develop, and the ego self axis is at this point unconscious. okay? So good enough parents, remember our meeting about parental complexes. So good enough parents kind of humanize the archetype for the child by providing safe and sound experiences in childhood that of course are going to help form a strong and resilient ego complex in the child, so that the child will, in this, like, let's say, ideal condition, will continue to grow and develop throughout an entire lifetime, right? So this ego complex can then face a lot of difficulties in adaptation to the environment, and also, of course, the inner environment, especially about the shadow and the shadow work, okay, and benefit from it. But we always keep thinking, of course, everybody's going to think, what if the child, as usually happens, does not experience a good enough childhood, has problems with parents, or the parents haven't been able to give such a perfect or ideal environment for the child, right? So of course, we can think, and we are going to be talking later about that with Professor Corbett, that the ego self-axis is perturbed, giving rise to problems later on in life, okay? But there is an author, Edward Edinger, that we have already referred to, and he talks in his book, Ego and the Archetype. He talks a lot about it, it was, I think his book was in the 70s. And he talks about the ego self-axis. So he summarized Jung's formulations, okay, in this way. Very simple way. It's complicated, but also at this point of our meetings is not so complicated, right? So the self is the ordering and unifying center of the total psyche, conscious and unconscious, just as the ego is the center of the conscious personality. We have already seen that. So he summarized the current working formula, we could say, that in the first half of life, the ego self separation, it's as we can see in these drawings, okay, the ego slowly, the personality will be maturing, and the ego will separate from the self. Oops, sorry. Okay. So in the first half of life, there's the ego self-separation, and we could roughly say in the second half of life, the ego self-reunion, okay? So the process of alternation between ego self-union and ego self-separation seems to occur repeatedly throughout the life of the individual, both in childhood and maturity. Indeed, the psychic, or better, spiral formula seems to express the basic process of psychological development from birth to death. So, in the service of developing the ego's strength and adaptation to life demands, the first half of life dynamics favor repression of emotionally overwhelming experiences. This condition reflects Edinger's ego self-axis separation state, okay? In the midlife passage, a developmental imperative initiates a shift in the dynamics, now in the service of remembering that which was dismembering at the time of the original wounding. So traumas and difficulties that the child, the teenage will go, and the personality, the maturing personality will have to face during the life cycle. So this corresponds, this remembering that which was dismembering at the time of the original wounding corresponds to Edinger's ego-self reunion. In the service of recovering wholeness, the ego is then challenged to open to the return of the repressed, which many times is experienced as death to the ego, because it means like an opening to the self, okay? I'm quite sure Professor Lana will help us here and expand more in these concepts. But so coming back to the drawings, and we are seeing a development of the personality here in these drawings of the ego self axis. So in the third, we see that the ego center emerges, right? Here. And the ego self-axis becomes partially conscious. So it is expected that when we mature, okay, in maturity, so there will be a theoretical limit that the ego is conscious of itself, like in here, and the self. And the ego self-axis acts as a means of communication, ideally, if you can say that. It's just a way so that we can understand in Jung's terms this development of the personality, okay? And what it means, the ego becoming conscious of itself in the first place, like in here, okay, like here, position at birth, and then little by little separating, let's say, from the self, and the ego self-axis becoming partially conscious, okay? So, and this whole process is followed by awareness of the separate self. So let's see. Don't worry, it's not that complicated. We have already experienced, yeah, right, Lionel. We have already started this meeting about the ego self-axis with the experience, let's say the practical, not the theoretical issues, in our previous meeting. So someone that hasn't watch the previous meeting, I strongly advise to, to watch, because then it's kind of better to have, contact with these concepts. So let's go a little further. So what could we say about the individuation that it's not so complicated for people that are not from the psychologists or, from the psychological fields? That the movement towards the making of an undivided and differentiated individual with a psychic center focus on the self, this would be individuation, in a non-linear, as we have seen, process of progressive awareness of the unconscious, which points to a kind of realization of the archetype of the self. That is the inauguration of a complete human being, if we could say that. As complete as we can be in this life, right? At this point of our consciousness. Sorry. Integrating apparently irreconcilable tendencies. For Jung, the goal is not to be perfect, but to be whole as we can be in this life, and building an integral personality. So Jung says in the collective works, his collected works, it's volume 13, that the development of the personality, it's a question of saying yes to oneself, of considering oneself as the most important of tasks, of being aware of everything one does, keeping oneself constantly in front of one's eyes in all our doubtful aspects, not hiding from our difficult aspects, okay? So in Reflecting the Soul, one of Joanna de Angelis and Divaldo's books with a lot of very nice authors, they cite Jung in this page and saying, so Jung saying, the goal is not to overcome our personal psychology, to become perfect, but to become familiar with it. Thus, individuation includes a growing knowledge of one's unique psychological reality, including personal strengths and limitations, and at the same time, a deep appreciation of humanity in general. So I brought now, it's to complicate a little bit so that Professor Corbett can help us to uncomplicate things, Lion. So this is in the book, this drawing is in the book, The New God Image from 1976 from Edward Edinger, okay? And I like this drawing because it can help us. I don't know if he had an intuition. I would love to see, we all would love to see Professor Corbett's opinions about these drawings. But I thought that for me, for instance, as we have already seen in the meeting about the self, for me, it's much clearer the way that Professor Corbett, like when he talks about the transpersonal dimension of the psyche, brings us this image of the ocean and each one of us as waves in the ocean. I think it's clear. But since we are talking about the ego-self axis, I thought that it would be interesting to discuss these drawings, Edinger drawing, because here, okay, as we have seen, he just repeats the other graphic about the ego-self axis, and the ego separating little by little from the self, right? The small circles here. But he talks about the great circle and the collective self, okay? In this bigger line here, encompassing every individual that it's represented here, let's say 4 individuals, right? 4 different stages of development, as we have seen in the first drawing. And he says you can see here that all of them are connected through a bigger, let's say a longer axis to what he calls center of collective self. And he calls also this the God image, or the self, as Professor Corbett says, is the same as the God image, okay? So he talks about a collective self. And that's what I thought it was interesting, because then we can start little by little talking about a non-dual approach that I know Professor Corbett talks a lot about, the non-dual approach to these issues about the self and the transpersonal dimension of the psyche. And also I thought about everything that we have been talking about, the Spiritist psychology, and about all the wonderful connections that the Spirit Joanna de Angelis brings to us, that we should think about the self also as the immortal spirit, okay? And that we know that all religions and mythologies, but especially all religions, they talk about us human beings as a big family, and all the values of fraternity, compassion, everything that makes us whole, not only whole as individual, so the process of individuation as a very personal process for each one of us, but also what it means in these days of transition of consciousness, expansion of consciousness. If we think, as Edinger is proposing, that all our selves are in a certain way unite in a collective self, and we all share this development of consciousness, that everything that we experience, even in the development of the God image, is shared among all of us, that it doesn't depend of different cultures, and it even, you know, different time and space separation, because the ego is connected to the time and space, but not the self, as we know. So just to give you some small sentence about this drawing, this is Edinger talking, okay? It says that the term God image is a synonym for the self, as we have seen in Jungian terms. But then he says, more specifically, the term God image is synonymous with a particular aspect of the self, what would be called the collective self. In other words, it is a transpersonal center shared by all humanity. I thought, Lionel and everybody else, that this was very similar to the non-dual, Joanna's non-dual approach, in a sense that we are all connected. We are all really brothers and sisters, emanating from the same life source, the transcendent source, whatever you want to call God, okay? So I thought this was kind of Edinger, an intuition or whatever that he had to talk about the collective self, but we can talk a little bit more about that. And he goes on saying that the different individual egos have larger or smaller areas outside the great collective circle, indicating greater or lesser degrees of consciousness. All God images are expressions of human experience and understanding of the autonomous or transpersonal psyche. All manifestations of the God image are stages of humanity's experience at any given time of the autonomous aspects of the psyche. So I know that Professor Corbett talks about that in his wonderful book that I already we already talked about here, and I hope everybody's reading. And then I would love to hear Professor Corbett talk in his ideas about this collective self that Edinger is talking about. Okay, so, and we are going to talk a little bit more about that, but so just to make a little clear, then I brought to you, as we have said in the WhatsApp group, the funny and beautiful metaphor and, you know, very nice movie, that one that you cannot die without watching it, the Groundhog Day, okay? So lots of spoilers. If anyone watching wants to stop here, watch the movie and come back, it would be nice. But just so to make a small summary, the story of Groundhog Day, okay, it derives from the Pennsylvania Dutch superstition that if a groundhog emerges from its burrow on this day and sees its shadow, it will retreat to its den, and winter will go on for 6 more weeks. If it does not see its shadow, spring will arrive early. So only in the summer you can see a lot of metaphors with the process of individuation, right? So some cute images of the groundhog, okay? And I went to look for the symbolism of the groundhog. Look how interesting. I found in the internet, and it says, if the groundhog crossed your path, it is asking you, let's think of the groundhog as a psychopomp, a guide of the soul, okay? I'm not sure the writer, the script writer, was realized all these symbolism metaphors, but of course he touched an archetype of many rebirth and death and a lot of things that we are talking here about the individuation process. So if the groundhog crossed your path, it is asking you to explore your states of consciousness more deeply, for by doing so, you will be able to find the answers within yourself. Look, the individuation process. You just haven't been digging deep enough to find your own roots. This guide may also be urging you to pay more attention to your metabolism, become aware of how your diet influences your body's natural cycles, and make adjustments to balance them. Alternatively, the groundhog could be warning you that you've crossed someone's boundaries, or similarly, that someone is crossing yours. The best way to resolve the situation is with respect and the heart. I thought it was a great symbolism. So this is a scene from the movie when the guy takes the groundhog and asks if he saw the shadow or not, okay? And so in reflecting the soul, Joanna says, the self, at the same time that it functions as an impulse to totality, to spiritual evolution, is still established in the condition of an embryo, like a seed that develops with each reincarnation, acquiring experiences and expanding its range of resources to reach its broad development. It is through the process of psychological maturity that the self frees itself from the layers that hinder its knowledge, so that it can thus free the divine essence of which it is constituted. The self is the immortal spirit itself, containing the initial and profound experiences of previous processes in which it developed the prodromes of the internal God present in it, in view of its divine origin since its creation. So back to the groundhog, what happened is the main character here, Bill Murray, he's wonderful in the movie. And so Phil Connors, a weatherman, very narcissistic, okay, in the beginning. And he's very bored to go to Punxsutawney, the city in Pennsylvania, where they have this big party with all the community involved, and do this thing of the groundhog, you know, being brought, and if the groundhog is seeing the shadow or not. And he's doing blah, 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 just, you know, I don't want to be here. This is below me and all this stuff. In the first day, it does very quickly and wants to go away because there is a snowstorm coming. But the snowstorm, actually it was not supposed to come, but then the snowstorm comes and they get stuck in the city. So look at here to our right, the image when he wakes up and realize that the same day is repeating itself. So what happens is that he's stuck in the Groundhog Day, and the day keeps repeating itself. Look here, he's gets a little paranoid, what's going on? And then he started getting depressed because he sees he's stuck. He doesn't have a way out of the day repeating itself. This is a wonderful character. It's like, I think it's like a trickster, but we can talk about this archetype another day because you know, it doesn't, we don't have enough time to talk about all these concepts. But here, he's really depressed here in the bottom to our left. And here to the right, he gets a car, and it's the first time that he tries to kill himself. He tries to commit suicide because he doesn't want to be stuck in this day repeating itself again. So he gets, Phil is also the groundhog, okay? And Phil Connors is the main character, and Phil is how they called the groundhog in the movie. And then he tries to commit suicide, but he keeps coming again in the same day. So I brought to you this. Do you know why the fingers of God and Adam don't touch in Michelangelo's famous painting in the Sistine Chapel? In the work, God's finger is stretched to the maximum here to the right, but Adam's finger has the last phalanges contracted. The sense of art is to explain that God is always there, but the decision to seek him is man's. If man wants to touch God, he will need to stretch his finger. But if he doesn't stretch, he can spend a lifetime without looking for him. The contracted last phalanx of Adam's finger represents free will. Okay, the bottom here of the finger of Adam's represents free will. So we have to be able to stretch our fingers, let's say in this metaphor, to connect to God or the transcendent, or, you know, this transpersonal dimension that brings meaning to our life. So what happens here is that he has taped so many times his part that he gets so depressed, bored, and he tries to kill himself so many times that he thinks this is a wonderful scene here up in the to your right, where Rita is, you know, his producer. And of course, he is in love with her, but he hasn't realized, and she's also a projection of his anima. Okay. Now that we know the metaphors and the symbolism. So he is drinking and smoking and eating a lot. And then it's a wonderful dialogue when he says, well, it tries to tell her that he is reliving the same day. And then he says, well, you know, I think I am God. And she said, well, I have many years of Catholic school, and I can tell you are not God. And then he said, yes, okay. I'm not saying I'm the God. I'm saying I'm a God. It's very funny the way that the guy says, because he simply cannot kill himself, right? But the thing is that little by little, he started, it's like a Buddhist principle of being in the moment. You know, when we talk a lot about mindfulness, meditation nowadays in the medical field. So living the moment and learning with the moment, everything is now. So since he tries to kill himself so many times, and he always keeps coming back in the same day, there's a lot of things going on. He tries also to have a love affair with Rita. Doesn't work because he's still in a narcissistic position. But then when he gives up, when he surrenders to what's going on with him, when the ego, as we have been talking in the beginning, surrenders to what's going on with the self and starts listening to the self, let's say, he starts paying attention at every detail that of the city, of the people of the city, and he then develops a higher consciousness, let's say, more connected. That's the individuation process. More connected. He realizes he's not God, and he's like everybody else, but he starts paying attention to everybody else. He develops empathy, compassion towards people in the city, and he starts learning a lot of classicals, Mozart and all the classicals, and French, because Rita liked French poetry. She was a specialist in French poetry. And this is him saving a little boy. Every day he would go run there because he knew the little boy would fall from the tree. And it's also a beautiful metaphor of our, then we could probably hear Lionel and Kai talking a little about, especially Kai that works with that. I don't know if Sylvia or other people too, but about the reincarnation process and the learning. It's a beautiful metaphor also about the learning that we have to do in this life, and that the ego has to struggle to learn and to understand what the self expects in this life, according to Joanna de Angelis and the Spiritist knowledge. Okay, so here in the beginning, he is playing the classicals, and this is Rita looking to him, and his music teacher also very proud of him. And here now that he already is, let's say, gave up trying to conquer Rita and paying attention to her, and now then it happens, then they fell in love, and really complete itself, themselves, let's say, in a sense that he is open to her and to the process of really what it means to fall in love with someone. So in Reflecting the Soul, the author says that by becoming conscious, human beings can live in harmony with their own nature. They become aware of the origin of their conflicts, thus enabling a constant expansion of their consciousness. When we seek an honest self-examination, our egos find an inner strength in which all possibilities of renewal reside. It is in our darkness, that we will find our remaining humanity, wisdom, compassion, and understanding of the meaning of our lives and our connection to the spirit that we are. In Civilization in Transition, Jung says that knowledge of the transcendent does not happen without a great development of human consciousness. It takes thousands of years, as it requires a slow process of psychic transformation and integration of what he calls eternal truths. So Joanna de Angelis, as we have seen in the last meeting, says in The Psychology of Gratitude that each human being is a specific cosmos who is lost in the secluded regions of the infinite. Transcendent, this localized cosmos reflects the experiences lived and accumulated in the deep personal unconscious of each individual, in the same way as they are registered in the collective unconscious. Probably Edinger's, going back to that drawing, what Edinger wanted to talk about also, or defined as a collective self, right? The transpersonal dimension, things like that. So the perspective of transcendence offers human beings an equally great meaning, because they do not and their evolutionary cycle when death happens, according to Joanna. Their goals are transferred from the narrow circle of corporeal injunction to the cosmic amplitude, extending indefinitely. Under this new perception, the transitory ego modifies its behavior due to the fascinating understanding of immortality and releases the self from its afflictive constraint. This immortalist vision also produces psychological growth, endowing the individual with moral confidence in identification with life, through which one overcomes the existential crisis. That's why Joanna thinks it's so important to understand the self also as our immortal spirit. So just to finish, I love this sentence to bring it again to you. Jung saying that the sole purpose of human existence is to turn on a light in the darkness of being. So I will stop share now so that we can have time to talk with Lionel and see his ideas about all of that we have been talking. So with you, Lionel.
Okay, thank you, Anahy. Well, let me just pick up on a few of the points that you talked about. So the notion of the ego self-axis really means the process of communication between consciousness and the unconscious, or the deepest level of the unconscious. Now, just to talk a little bit about that developmental scheme that you talked about, the idea is that in infancy, the baby experiences the self, the bigger self, the transpersonal or the divine self, actually projected onto the mother. So the original Jungian idea was that the mother carries, or the important parent carries, the experience of the self for the child. So if there is a disturbance, it's a projection of the self onto the parent. So if there is a disturbance in the parent-child relationship, like early childhood trauma or parental rejection or abuse, then the child cannot develop a connection to the self because it should be carried by the parent, but it can't be carried by the parent if the parent is abusive. So then what we have is a situation of alienation between the ego and the self. Then we say that the ego self-axis is disturbed, and you end up with an individual who can't accept themselves. They have low self-esteem. They even have the sense that they shouldn't exist. So one of the functions of psychotherapy is to repair this ego self-axis. And a lot of psychotherapeutic practice talks about how to repair this connection between the ego and the self. So what you have to imagine in this model is that consciousness is not born and consciousness does not die. Consciousness with a capital C, the transpersonal self, which is the totality of consciousness, is always present. So when the baby is born, it starts to experience this totality of consciousness, the self. And the self acts as a kind of blueprint or a ground plan for the development of the personality. It's as if the self gives the personality a set of potentials. So, for example, imagine you're the baby Mozart or something like that. You have a tremendous spiritual potential to become a musician. Those potentials are given by the self. It's part of that personality's blueprint. Then as that person goes through life, these potentials of the self have to incarnate themselves. That means they have to embody themselves. So that's where the ego comes in. Somebody has to give that child music lessons and an instrument, and the child has to learn how to use the instrument. And that would be the development of the ego, incarnating or embodying those potentials of the self. But that's true for all the potentials of the personality. They are all given by the self, and they all gradually incarnate or embody themselves over the course of one's life. And that really is what is meant by individuation. The way you become the personality that you were intended to become in terms of is to embody these spiritual potentials that were present at birth, that you gradually incarnate over time. And this includes, for example, the individual's vocation. So whatever your vocation is, you might be a teacher or a healer or a priest or a warrior or a merchant, whatever it is. That vocation, according to Jung, is part of this set of spiritual potentials that's given by the self. So your vocation is a calling from the self to take up a certain pursuit. It's not really something that the ego chooses. It's really given to you. Jung says it's like the Tao moving through you. And to the extent that you are listening to this inner call and your inner vocation, which is correct for you because it's given to you, you'll be much more happy than if you're in a career or a profession which is not your true vocation. So that's one aspect of development. The other point about this integration of consciousness and the unconscious is that individuation means that all the non-ego parts of the personality that we've talked about, like the shadow or the anima and the animus, all have to become as conscious as possible as we develop. That increasing consciousness of the non-ego parts of the personality fosters the individuation process, and that includes the development of the inferior function. I'm not sure if people here are familiar with Jung's typology, but he says that everybody has a set of functions. He singles out thinking, feeling, intuition, and sensation. And he says that one of those four functions is what's called the superior function. It's the one that you're very good at, the best at. And the one that's opposite to that is what's called the inferior function, or the fourth function. This would be a discussion on its own. And the individuation process means that you have to develop your inferior function. So, for example, if you're a thinking type, very good at logic and order and planning and topics like mathematics and so on, your feeling function is likely to be inferior. So individuation would require that you develop your feeling function. If you're a feeling type, somebody who's very conscious of emotions, very conscious of feelings, very sensitive to other people's feelings, and you're in a profession like nursing or medicine or something that requires that, then the individuation process would involve developing the inferior function, which in this case would be thinking. So someone who's a feeling type might in later life study a subject that requires thinking, like philosophy or something like that. I don't want to talk about the whole typology because it would take all the time, but just so you know that individuation requires the development of the inferior function. So Jung thinks that the process of individuation, this business of becoming the personality that you were destined to become, is different for everybody, and it's never complete. We only approximate it. We keep getting closer and closer to individuation, but we never quite get there. But in the process, we become distinct individuals, unique. What that means is we don't have a collective psychology. we're not mass-minded. We don't just believe what everybody else believes around us. Individuation means that you have your own mind, your own personality, although at the same time, you have to remain related to others and related to your society. You can't individuate without relationships, but you develop a kind of a uniqueness, a unique way of expressing who you are. So individuation is not egocentric. It opens you to the world, but it makes you allows you to be in the world in a very unique way. And most of the Jungians think that in world mythology, the individuation process is imagined by the hero's journey, or the night sea journey, or death rebirth themes, descent to the underworld. Those are very common mythological themes by which Jung thought that the process of individuation is depicted. And the importance of psychotherapy is only that it will speed up the process or facilitate the process. But even if you never have psychotherapy, Jung thinks that this development of the personality, this connection between the ego and the transpersonal self, will happen naturally. And one of the main ways that this happens is by paying attention to dreams, which is why we stress attention to dreams a great deal. And Jung actually thought that development during the lifespan has two stages. He thought that in the first half of life, we are busy developing an ego and adapting to outer reality, work and career and relationships and so on. But in the second half of life, which often begins with a midlife crisis, people start to, as they approach death especially, they start to ask spiritual questions about values and meaning and prepare for death, which is the goal of life, according to Jung. And for that purpose, Jung thinks that paying attention to dreams and spiritual development in general is particularly important. Sometimes the individuation process is stimulated by a crisis or an illness that stimulates the need for consciousness. Not sure what else to say. I think just one comment about what Edinger was calling the collective self. The way I understand that is a comment of Jung that the self, the capital S self, is the same in all of us. It has to be. It's like a divine essence in the personality. So obviously it has to be the same in all of us. So perhaps that's that fact that it's the same in all of us. We all participate in that, is what he means by a collective self. That's how I understood that diagram. But from a non-dual point of view, you see, the ego, or the sense that I have a separate self, little s self, a personal self, that's really an illusion, because the ego, or the personal self, is really a part of the larger self. Only the larger self is reality. The ego is simply a kind of adaptation to everyday reality. But really, at the non-dual level, there is only the larger totality of the bigger self, and there are no individual selves. So in a way, it's a mistake to talk about the individual self, if by that you mean something separate from the totality. Because really from a non-dual point of view, there are no other selves and there are no separate selves. There is just the totality of the transpersonal self. I think that's all I have to say about what you said, Anahy. Can we discuss it a bit?
Yes. Let's start. I'm just looking in the chat that nobody puts any questions, so we can go. Sylvia is with your hand.
Okay.
Go
Sylvia.
ahead.
Yes, I have a question actually. I understand what you said towards the end of Lionel, sorry, towards what you were saying at the end. that the personal self doesn't exist, part of the whole. I know to a certain extent, I understand that, and I agree, but I think we still keep who we are, even though we're part of the whole, we're still who we are. Would that, because that I know I understand it, we don't lose our essence in itself. Because, you know, one point you made, that individuation is actually not something reflexive, but is opening up, so feel part of the whole thing. You know, feel that we are a stone, a star, whatever, but we never lose the essence of who we are. Is that correct, my assumption?
Yeah. If you look at the great spiritual teachers, and people like the Buddha or Jesus Christ or enlightened masters, they retained their personality, as you say. They had an individual personality. But the reason we call them enlightened is because they were aware that they really are the totality. The personality is only an adaptive device to get us through everyday life. It's not our true nature. These great sages realized that, and they were in touch with the larger consciousness, but they did, as you say, they did retain a kind of individual personality at the same time.
In a way, it would be almost like a sunlight, isn't it? It goes everywhere, but it's still not touched by it. It touches everything, but it's not touched somehow, isn't it? That purity that we have in our souls and who we are as a creation of God, which I believe in God, that essence, it's developed, flourishes, becomes one with the whole. And I think becoming one with the whole, we understand that we are one amongst everything. I think that's the process of development, as I see it, that we have within us, and it flourishes as we educate ourselves spiritually, as we grow. And then we realize, we come to the realization that we are ourselves, but as a part of the whole. I feel, if it's okay to think like that, you think?
Yeah, I think it's okay to think like that. It depends the level that you're talking about. You see, at the non-dual level, where there is only the totality, there are no parts. There are only, you know, there's only the totality. At the dual level that we live in everyday life, we feel separate, and the world seems to consist of parts. So it depends on the level that you're talking about.
Well,
yeah,
yes,
sorry.
I mean, sorry, beg your pardon. I experience of day-to-day life sometimes can be quite isolating. We feel we're not part of thing. But spiritually, as we, you know, like doing this course and trying to learn from each other, it sort of brings to mind this point of our spirituality, that we are far beyond what we are as parts. And we are, you know, because we are created as spirits, we're created by a being of intelligence, and we are part, and as we learn spirituality is to be part of everything, you know, as a whole. Anyway, I just thought that it's
Thank
okay
you,
to think like
Sylvia.
that. May I just make as well a very, very brief point? The explanation you were giving, Anahy, before, you know, about perfection and quoting Jung and everything, it sort of brought me to memory chapter 17 of the Gospel according to Spiritism, about being perfect. You know, when Jesus said, be perfect as your Father who's in heaven, and we're trying to be that. But then all the explanations that the spirits give us is that we're never going to be perfect as God, but our aim is to try and to be as perfect as we can. And eventually we will reach a level of perfection. So I just thought it was so interesting to bring the two together. Anyway, thank you. It was really
we always,
clever.
when we talk about that, we always refer to the gospel according to Spiritism, especially because of this part of trying to be perfect. But we have to understand that it's the process that they are talking to us about, the process of trying to, striving to, struggling to And that's the way. And I think Jung and what we all understand, as Lionel is talking about, is this approximation, let's say, trying to get near to our unconscious in this life, the individuation process, and to be as whole as possible, and to manifest our vocation, as Lana is saying, in this world. And Joanna de Angelis would agree, of course, and she talks about that the calling, vocation, right, Lionel, the calling, the inner calling is given by the self.
Mhm.
So spiritually talking, we are all agreeing that the self contains our personal myth, our sacred story, our vocation, vocatus, right? The calling in Latin. So let's see, Mariana.
Okay.
And I think Kai is also first, Mariana.
Hi, Anahy. Just a question, because when I saw the draw, I always had in my mind that it's the ego can also be a part of the self when the ego is inflated. So if I can say like this. Is it like this? Because all the draws is like they are at least together with the self. It is like this. It's a possibility, because I have in my mind, like, I don't know why, since I start to study, I have that it can also, the ego can also be a part of the self.
It has to be a part of the self, because the self is the totality. If it's the totality, it's everything. So that includes the ego. It's just that the ego feels separate because we have sense organs and a brain that make us feel separate. That's the way this organism works. But the self is the totality of consciousness. It's not confined to a body or 5 senses.
Lionel, I think Mariana is also talking about, that case, Miss Miller and things like that. They don't know, but just I think she's also asking about the inflation of the ego. If the ego identifies too much with the self,
Yeah.
it could get inflated, or think,
Yeah, then you get grandiosity and self-importance and so on. Yes, yes.
Okay, but it's always connected. Yeah, I understand that it's always connected, but it's only the draw maybe mix it up here in my mind, because I had also in my mind that it can be part of, not only because it was okay in the birth, it was inside, and then it's going out until the yeah, from ego.
Eddington's diagram is misleading because he makes the ego with a solid circle, a solid line around it. But that's a mistake. That's why that diagram is a bit misleading, because that makes it look like the ego is separate, but it's really not. It feels separate because it's in a body.
That's why I also wanted to bring Mariana Edinger's drawing to, especially when Lionel said he would be present, because it's very popular among Jungian analysts in Brazil and all these discussions. So I think it's very important what Professor Corbett is saying about being misleading, in a sense that, it looks like a separate thing.
Mm-hmm.
And we usually in our minds, it's a way of teaching that we do graphics and things like that. And that's why I told you that I thought Lionel's metaphor with the ocean and us being waves, because waves are not separate.
Yeah.
They don't have limits, right? You cannot say where the wave, you can see the wave, but you cannot separate the wave, the water of the wave, from the water of the ocean. So I think it's much more, the metaphor is stronger. Sorry, I interrupted you. Would you want to ask something, Mariana?
No, that it was like this. Yeah, because I understand that at the end it's everything to me. It's myself. I am the self. Huh? And the ego is like what I needed to live here. And so many factor and aspect is going to change or to build this ego. It's just because yeah, when I start to study and I made my draws, and in one moment I had in my mind that I did, that is the ego, it's far apart from the self, when it's exactly in this moment that it's totally inflated. So I have no conscience of myself, but it's not that. So the self is there, of course, but the conscience is totally of who I am, or God feelings. Maybe I don't know. Psychopaths say this, no? People
Psychopaths?
that it's totally they don't have this connection with the self. Can I say this? No.
Lionel, what do you think?
Sorry, I didn't quite understand. Could you paraphrase the question for me?
Yeah, of course. In this moment, it's my my draws, what I did a long time ago. Not a long time ago, but when I was studying this subject, and then I made the draws myself, doing that. It's the self, of course, and the ego. The ego only the small part of this. But in the moment that the ego is not connected anymore with the self, it's apart from the self. This ego, it's totally inflated. In this moment that it's inflated, that it's I'm not conscious anymore of myself. No, I don't have this connection anymore. I can say that it's people that they react like psychopaths.
The ego can never really be separate from the self.
Okay.
Because only the self is real, only the self exists. But when I think perhaps you're right, that when the ego is not in touch with the larger consciousness of the self, it feels like there is nothing else, and then it feels like I'm everything, only I exist. That would be inflation or grandiosity. Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah. So yeah, because there is not this connection.
There's no no connect. There's no sense.
This conscious connection.
Yeah, there's no sense of something larger than me. Yeah. Yes.
Okay.
That would be inflation. And you see that in narcissistic personalities who think they're very special, very important, you know.
Yeah, even narcissistic personality, yeah.
They're very harmful people very often.
Okay.
And also just to make it clear, because you talked about psychopaths, right? That and also then it's different because people mix a lot with psychotics. So just to make it clear to everybody, Lionel, what would you say that could related to the ego self axis that could lead a person to psychosis, to a psychotic state?
Psychosis means that the ego is completely disrupted, and the ego is overwhelmed by the deep levels of the unconscious. There is a deep level of the unconscious, which is what's called the mythopoetic level, where myths and religions arise. So when that level floods the personality and disrupts the ego, the person starts to feel mythic imagery, like I'm God, or I'm the Blessed Virgin Mary, or that kind of religious imagery means that the ego is gone and it's been flooded by this archetypal level of the psyche, the end of the world and all that kind of mythic imagery. But then there's no ego. It's not that the ego is inflated, it's just that the ego is overwhelmed by the mythic level of the psyche.
Did you understand the difference, right? Because there is a difference, and people usually have a hard time So Kai, sorry.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mariana.
I would like just to extend the idea of Jung with the what comes from, you know, we inherit from the psyche or the potentials that are here to for us to develop. If we extend the idea to reincarnation, so these maybe memories that are in the psyche, in the self, are the heritage from the past that we are allowed to develop in this lifetime. So there is a reason for us, that's what I'm trying to say, to be connected to these archetypal potentials, right? There is a reason for us in this lifetime to have the call to go through to a certain profession, to meet some people and develop some things, to have a partnership with someone. So there are reasons that are not limited in this just present lifetime. And I think it's important to extend the idea and go beyond that. The self offers to us, yes, the opportunity, but maybe the memories come from before.
Yeah. Yeah, one way of saying that is that your archetypal endowment is an imprint on the soul from past lives, what are called samskaras. Yeah.
Yes. And another thing quickly is like when you talk about the self and the ego and the big self, and we are like connect to it. I imagine the fractals. So the self is the fractal, the big self. And we are repetitions in small scale of the main picture, the main object, the main metaphorically. So I think fractals are repetitions of the same image in smaller and smaller size. So imagine us like in this smaller size of the self. That's just an idea.
Yeah.
No?
The self is an image of divinity. How can it be small? I don't quite know. Are you talking about the personal self?
I'm talking about the ego. Yes.
Oh, yeah, that's the same as the ego. Yeah, that can be small, certainly.
Yes, and because you are in an evolution path. So yeah, the totality that one day we are going to comprehend is like maybe we are the shadows of it. I hope one day we will.
No.
No?
You can't pour the ocean into a teacup. That would be like trying to understand God. We shouldn't. It's not going to happen. Sorry.
It's okay, Lionel. Thank you.
Okay. Sylvia, before, wasn't Bianca with her hand raised, Bianca? No? Is okay?
Yeah, it's okay. I was just trying to say something about what Sylvia and Professor Karl were speaking. And maybe it's much easier to understand of the point of the spirit. We are entire, and when we come in every incarnation that we just have a part of ourselves, what we actually prepare before we are coming here. So I think Professor Cabot, when he spoke about ego and the part, just that's not the entire, and it's true, it's not the entire, it's just a part of our spiritual part knowledge, and we use it in this life for every for moral, for intellectual, and all the quality that we have like a spirit. We just develop just the part that we prepare. Just what I want to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Bianca. Thank you. So Sylvia wants, we still have time for one or two more.
Very briefly. I just actually say something that Kai was saying, because the question of extending our potentials, and Lino said something about this as well. But many times in our reincarnation, when we reincarnate, say for instance, an example that was given of Mozart, was, you know, the greatest musician ever in humanity, but he might come in an incarnation that you have nothing to do with music, because he needs to develop some other parts of his personality, some other parts of himself. So, you know, he will learn what engineering or whatever it is. So I think that is the extension as well, of blocking some of the potential that you've already developed, so we can develop others, because eventually, as a spirit, you know, like this person is explaining, we have two wings. We need both moral and intellectual. So we develop all those potentials as we go along, isn't it? And at times we come to learn something different from the potential we already have.
One of the ways this can go wrong is if you're born in a family that doesn't allow you to express these potentials. You know, you might, that's what you're saying. You might be born in a family that's not interested in music, and then that potential is not developed. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you, Sylvia. So are we all okay? No more questions? So we thank you very much, all of you that are on vacation and are here with us at tonight, and everybody that's going to be watching, and especially Professor Corbett being here with us today, and Kai, Sylvia, everybody, Mariana that has brought has brought the collaboration, and we'll see you in 2 weeks. Yeah. So have a wonderful end of Sunday, right? And we'll see you in 2 weeks.
Yes,
Thank
because
you.
also, Anahy, just one
Yeah.
thing, it's not reaching the goal. The aim is not reaching the goal, but what we learn while we're trying to get there, isn't it?
Yes, that's the way. That's
So
the way.
in 2 weeks' time, we come back to learn some
Hi,
more.
Anne,
Thank you.
Bob.
Bye-bye. God bless
So
everyone.
see you